A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Now, I finished this book about a week ago now as of the recording of this video, and today I'd like to say a few words on it. It's an interesting thing for me, Dickens, because growing up, this fella here always appears when you're learning English at school, the odd extract from Oliver Twist or Great Expectations and whatnot, and in that regard I think we, or at least I, have a tendency to associate his works with agonizing English lessons to a bunch of 12-year-olds who don't care in the slightest. And therefore, despite the fact that Dickens here is obviously a staple of English literary canon, one of the most prominent writers ever in the English language, I have never read any of his books front to back until now. I was in a charity shop about a month ago now, and saw this rather fancy little volume here, for dirt cheap as well, and thought, oh, why not? It's his shortest novel, after all, and many would argue his best, so let's give it a shot. And so I have. So let's get into what this classic is all about then, and as always, no substantive spoilers beyond the synopsis. So, A Tale of Two Cities is set in the years leading up to and during the French Revolution. The first one, that is. In particular, the Reign of Terror, as it's popularly known, where tens of thousands of suspected enemies of the revolution were put to the guillotine. So, in that regard, it's in my good books from the start. Historical fiction is my favourite genre. It really captures the anarchy and indiscriminate violence in the early part of the revolution incredibly well, which I'll get into shortly. The book follows no individual protagonist throughout. There's no one main character. However, it begins with the journey to Paris of Mr. Jarvis Lorry, an English banker who meets with Dr. Manette, a French physician, released after 18 years held in the Bastille. Mr. Lorry and Dr. Manette, alongside his daughter Lucy, then make their way back to London. And this is where it becomes difficult to construct a synopsis for a video like this, given that the vast majority of the action happens in the second half of the novel. Broadly speaking, the book is split into two. The first half is set in London, the second half is set in Paris. The London half is more to lay the foundations, to get you acquainted with the characters, before you tackle the real meat and bones of the novel in the second half, where the plot really starts to pick up in full motion. So let's get into some of the characters then, because it's one of the novel's greatest strengths. Many of the characters are incredibly intriguing and witty, and just fascinating to read about. Jarvis Lorry, the banker, the man of business, as he dubs himself throughout the novel, is a gentle, lovely old man, always trying to steer the ship through pretty dire circumstances. You then have the Doctor, Dr. Manette, a caring old man plagued by his wrongful detention in the Bastille, and a whole ensemble of other very well-written characters, in particular Monsieur and Madame Defarge a bit later on. But perhaps the most famous character from the novel, and the only one I knew of prior to reading it, is a certain Sidney Carton, who is absolutely exceptional. This depressed, alcoholic, self-loathing barrister who is talented and young, he's got his whole life ahead of him, but he's at rock bottom, unable to express himself in the ways he would like to. And he is handled brilliantly. He's the only one in the novel who has a character arc of sorts, the only one who grows quite considerably over time. And some of the passages which concern him are some of the most beautiful prose throughout the entire novel. This passage here in particular, on his depressive state, is just fantastic. Climbing to a high chamber in a well of houses, he threw himself down in his clothes on a neglected bed, and its pillow was wet with wasted tears. Sadly, sadly, the sun rose. It rose upon no sadder sight of a man of good abilities and good emotions, incapable of their directed exercise, incapable of his own help and his own happiness, sensible of the blight on him, and resigning himself to let it eat him away. His whole character is as tragic as it is intriguing, by far and away the most complex character in the novel, especially his scenes throughout the final act of the novel. Great stuff. The same, perhaps, cannot be said of some of the other characters in the novel. Arguably, the two characters most at the heart of the novel's plot, Lucy and Charles Donnay, are really, really boring. They're not offensive at all, in my opinion, but just kind of exist. Lucy, in particular, is very much how should I say it, idealized Victorian archetype of what a woman should be. That is to say, almost comically pure and innocent and virtuous, which is great and all, but that's all she is. Beyond being perfect, there's no substance to her, no depth of character, I'd say. And I know you see this a lot in old novels. The Count of Monte Cristo, for instance, a novel I love to death. I always found it silly that these Parisian ladies would faint over the slightest impetus, like they would see someone stub their toe and just collapse. Similar thing here with Lucy. It's a very dated idealization of a Victorian woman, which is a shame given that the other two main female characters, Miss Pross and Madame Defarge, are fantastic. But anyway, the characters are great on the whole. The plot is surprisingly complex, darting back and forth between London and Paris over the course of about 15 years. As I mentioned earlier, the second half, principally set in Paris, is where the magic happens. The imagery that Dickens conjures up in depicting the chaos and social upheaval of the Reign of Terror is really interesting. I love how the guillotine is characterized as this divine instrument worthy of veneration, sang guillotine as they call it, with the executioners as ministers to this holy figure. The newly formed Republic as this hateful, vengeful mess of mindless violence, this unstoppable force which tramples all in its path, innocent and guilty, as if to fulfill a quota of sorts to sustain itself. And in this regard, a common critique I often see with the novel is that it's very biased, very bigoted depiction of the revolution. Essentially, England good, France bad. Monarchism good, republicanism bad. Which, sure, there probably is some truth to that, but I don't think Dickens is offering a critique of republicanism intrinsically, but rather the means by which one may get there, That is, the old regime, the ancien regime, was rampantly corrupt and indiscriminately violent against its own people. Right, let's change all that by becoming a republic. How do we do that? By being rampantly corrupt and indiscriminately violent. While the ultimate goal is virtuous, the means by which we get there perpetuate the very same cruelty from which the revolutionaries are trying to destroy. Liberty, equality, fraternity, or death, as Dickens puts so many times throughout the novel. So while, yes, it is an English novel, assuredly with English prejudice, it's not propagandistic, I felt, which it very well could have been given Dickens' influence. And I think with that, I'll start to wrap up here. It's a great novel. It exceeded my expectations. It wasn't the long, incredibly annoying slog that Victorian novels can be. And while, yes, it is incredibly wordy and tiresome at times with its prose, it makes up for it by having some of the most beautiful, evocative passages of anything I've ever read, of late at least. The last couple chapters in particular are exceptional in that regard. Now, in my last video on Pachinko by Minjin Lee, I would heartily recommend giving that a watch. I said that I would be putting these novels on a tier list. I've completely rescinded that idea pretty much immediately. My thoughts on a lot of these books are always changing. They're far too ambulatory for a tier list to really capture how I feel about them. So yeah, my final thoughts on A Tale of Two Cities. It's great, I would highly recommend it, and I can see why of his novels. It's one of, if not his most highly regarded. But yeah, I think I've said all I needed to say. Thank you for watching.